Hello and welcome back to AEF TV in association with Angerati, and I'm joined now by Mikael Karlsson, who's the CEO of Globeleq, and we were talking a bit off air about what you do and you know the type of engagement you have in Africa, and in particular we're talking about three projects that in this last year are at various stages of completion, which have around the renewable energy piece, and we both kind of thought that that'd be a good discussion to have.
Yeah.
You know about those projects clearly because your company was involved in that. So tell us a little bit more about those three projects.
Yeah, sure. I mean, these three projects are part of the Renewable Energy Program in South Africa. And as you might be aware, the government has kind of announced that they're going to double the capacity of power installed capacity in South Africa from 40,000 to 80,000 megawatts. And of that, 42% is going to be renewable energy. So that's 18,000 megawatts, which is going to be implemented until 2030 in South Africa.
And this is a directive. This is how we want to generate power.
This is how we want to generate power.
Right.
And so it's kind of a revolution in the African context of renewable energy power, because before we kind of looked at smaller fragmented markets, and so they already rolled out the first set of those, which is 3,725 megawatts, and there was a round one in 2011 where they awarded about 1,500 megawatts of power. There was a round two 2012 where they awarded another 1,000 megawatts. So today we have 2,500 megawatts of power already awarded. And there's a third phase coming out this August.
Right.
And then in addition to this, they have announced an additional 3,200 megawatts, which is going to come every August for the next 3 years. So as an investor, it's a wonderful opportunity. You got clarity as to what the country wants to do. And we participated in round one. We got awards for 140 megawatt wind projects and 250 megawatt solar projects, which we then reached financial closing on last year, and we are now constructing.
So you guys also financed the project with the understanding that there is a market, and you know you're going to be able to sell this power out. One of the things about renewable energy, which a lot of people talk about, is obviously it's an intermittent power source. And how do you see, or what type of technologies do you see coming in which are going to help store that power or try to level it off? I asked that question because there's personal interest. I'm writing an article on it at the moment.
Yeah, that's good. Great. I mean, first of all, storage of power is troublesome because it's not very cost effective. So the most natural storage you have in the systems is if you have hydro capacity. So essentially if you got dams, you use the intermittent solar
to pump things back up.
Well, you don't pump them up, you just use that power when it's available, the solar and the wind, and then you close the dam, and so you essentially just store the hydropower, and then when it's not blowing or it's not sunny, during the night, you then use the hydropower. That's the kind of most natural system. And what we're seeing in Central America, where we're also very active, we are having wind assets producing power into thermal oil-based systems. So our power is actually cheaper than the oil-based power is, just on the marginal cost of production of oil versus a full-in cost for renewables. And there we're also seeing that in the rainy season, when you get a lot of hydro, you don't have a lot of wind. In the dry season, when you don't have a lot of hydro, you have enormous amount of wind, because that's the kind of windy season. So I think the best one is to get complementary power sources. South Africa is unusual because you got so much thermal capacity, you got so much coal-based capacity, base load, that even if you put 18,000 megawatts into that 80,000 megawatts, it's still going to be okay. The system is big enough that it will balance itself out.
Yeah, and that's what it's about. Everything's got to join up, doesn't it, in order to do that? Is that a challenge in countries where, I was talking this morning to a couple of ministers who are here looking at obviously making connections, people like yourselves probably, but one of the challenges was actually we've got nothing. We've got nothing that joins this up with that and so on. Isn't that a massive challenge?
It is. If you are a Minister of Energy of an African country today, you're going to kind of figure out how am I going to attract the investor community. And the best way is just to have very clear, transparent rules about what you want to do in your energy sector. You know, how much power do you want from renewables? How much do you want from thermal? Communicate that transparently, and then have a transparent procurement process for how you're going to procure that power, and have some form of a standardized contract. I mean, in South Africa, you have this procurement structure. Everybody knows exactly what the rules of the game is. You compete on tariff for 70%, you compete for economic development on the remaining 30%. Everybody gets the same power purchase agreement with Eskom. Everybody gets the same implementation agreement with the government. A couple of differences based on how you bid tariff and economic development, but everybody knows what they're getting. And so far that mobilized $9.5 billion of capital, primarily from the private sector.
Yeah.
You know, great majority.
I mean, that to me just sounds like immense common sense. You know, if you have that transparency, everybody knows what they're working for, that sort of open platform, you know, then fosters confidence and innovation. And it immediately conjures up the question, is, okay, why isn't that the norm? Or is that just too simplistic a question to ask?
I mean, you know, power sector is political, right? So, you know, you're going to have to decide your political priorities, and some countries, you know, have kind of focused more on private sector participation. Others focus more on kind of the old traditional way, your government-owned utility that is kind of building the power. And, you know, those two different models are, in my view, not really.
They're kind of incompatible, aren't they?
Yeah, in some ways they are, right? Because you cannot be private sector participants almost like an island in a kind of a government sector. In some ways you become somewhat vulnerable. And the other thing is, you know, new power has to compete with new power prices. And so if you are a minister or a utility, you sit there and you say, okay, I'm going to compare this new wind farm with my existing power tariffs. Well, the wind farm is always going to be more expensive than the asset base that's already depreciated, the capital's been paid back on it.
Because of the upfront capital investment.
Exactly, because new capital invested. But you can compare that with something new that the government would do, and then you find that the private sector is always a lower cost producer because we run the assets better, we structure them better, and that's just a, you know, well-recognized fact. So I think the government needs to get their policies in a place where the private sector can rely on those policies, and they're there for the long term, so we can plan. I mean, our investment horizon is 20, 25 years. Yep. So, you know, we just made another big investment in Africa, in Cote d'Ivoire, where they started privatization of the energy sector back in the early 1990s. Actually, under the current president's leadership when he was Prime Minister, Ouattara. And they've always been committed to private sector involvement in the energy sector. And although they went through this post-conflict period now, when we're building a new asset, you know, we kind of have confidence in that system that they want private power and the structure actually works. So I think that's going to be the key, is if you want private sector to have clear rules, transparent rules, new deals compete with new deals on tariff. And
a regulator, a strong regulator that can mediate and depoliticize it, I suppose?
You know, the regulator in most of these places is not really all that independent, right? It's hard to be an independent regulator when you're appointed by the government, and most of the sector participants are governments. So there is political influence on the regulator. What needs to be done is you need to have very clear rules, and you need to have a strong power off-taker that could enter into long-term contract, and they need to honor that contract for 20 years. And, you know, and that utility needs to have enough income that they can meet these obligations. So, you know, they have to have an underlying tariff that works. And in many places you see subsidized tariffs, which is okay politically if that's what you want to do from the government's perspective. But sometimes it put pressures on the utilities to be able to meet that tariff obligation. And that's when you then have the government stepping in with a guarantee. In some cases we get World Bank, IFC, and so on involved on top of that to guarantee the government's performance.
Because I suppose you have the other factor, which is about, and I remember there are a couple of interviews on the Engerati website that kind of touch on that, where you've got that social obligation factor, where yes, we want to provide electrification, but we've got a chunk of our population that can't necessarily afford market rate. So how do we get it in there? And then how do we design that equation so that it's right? Because if you don't, And I remember seeing a recent documentary in India where you had all the power lines, and then you had people just climbing up and just tapping it off. So you're generating the power, but no, people aren't paying for it.
Well, in a lot of the states in India, power is free anyway for farmers and so on.
Yeah.
But what happens in India is actually interesting. The industrial consumers pay a lot. They actually pay very high rates. And so they start to replace that with their own facilities. So the better customers get their own generation, and you get fewer and fewer customers that could pay that industrial subsidized tariff for the masses. Yeah. It is a big challenge to how you subsidize this, right? But I would argue the most expensive power is the power you don't have.
Yeah.
You don't really know what it is not to have power unless you go and have to do homework at the bus station, because that's the only light there is for you to do homework. And in sub-Saharan Africa today, only about 1 in 6 have access to power. And so, we're starting to see more and more kind of common power sources really for the mobile phones. You got charging of batteries for mobile phones in some centralized places in some of these villages. And many times they have like a solar panel on top of that roof that's then generating power, right?
Yeah.
And it may be that we're going to go into a more distributed power model in some of these African countries, like what we've done in the phone system. Yeah. Instead of having kind of a strong fixed network that goes everywhere, you just have mobile phone islands.
Well, that's what I was going to touch on, because it seems to me like there is an opportunity, and it's such a big discussion, because you've got the whole environmental argument. You're like, we don't want to pave over these beautiful lands, but then you don't want to deprive people either, so they need electricity, and that's what I was going to ask you. Is I get a feeling that Africa needs a new model, and some of it is decentralized. Where if you have a village that's next to a stream, where it makes sense to have a micro hydro type environment. Are you guys involved in any of that at all, and from an sort of R&D or looking at it perspective, or what do you personally think?
We're not, because for two reasons really. Number one, it turns out that these small micro power facilities ends up being quite expensive.
Yeah.
But that's not the reason we're not involved, because if you did it more in a mass distribution way, then prices would come down. It's simply because for us to be involved in an investment, to make it worth our while from a resource perspective, to allocate resources, we need to invest at least $50 million. Right? And so if you're going to put that into single home rooftops, just imagine the number of rooftops you have to get to get to $50 million investment. It's very substantial.
And that's where the things start flipping. So we're nearly at the end of our time here at the interview, and let me go away from all this and ask you a situational question. You're obviously here at Africa Energy Forum. What are some of the discussions that you may have already had up until now where you go, oh well, that's interesting, or that's new, or that's different? You're within your rights to answer. I haven't had any of those yet.
No, I mean there are some. Obviously, I was in the hardball session this morning. I talk about the political implications of finding natural resources, oil and gas in East Africa. Whether that's Tanzania and Mozambique with very huge gas finds, or in Kenya with some oil finds and so on, and how that is going to affect the energy sector. What policies should the government put in place to actually get some of that gas to generate power in the domestic market, and the conflict of interest between the big resource intensive developers of these resources, whether that's the big oil and gas companies or who it is, who wants to do this primarily for export LNG. That's kind of how they get recovery of the huge investments, versus a relatively small domestic market. And so the key question is, how do you start that domestic market? You get some gas in, you start generating electricity, then you build an industrial base that starts using the gas to build employment opportunities, more demand for power, and you're off to something that could actually feed on itself quite nicely. And so the question is, how do you kind of crack that big challenge? I think that's one issue. The other issue, the $1 million question, or kind of $1 billion question, is what's going to happen in Nigeria.
Right, yeah.
I wish I had some wisdom to share with you, but in my mind I actually got more questions right now as to what's going to happen in Nigeria than answers.
Yeah. What are your sort of key questions around that?
Well, I mean, Nigeria has a huge potential. It's one of the largest countries, obviously in Africa, population-wise. I think they got 170 million people, 4,000 megawatts of installed capacity, which is, if you do the numbers, is one of the lowest installed capacity in the world.
Doesn't work.
Doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
And it works because a lot of homes and industries and so on have self-generation.
Right.
But you know, and obviously the president and the administrations put a lot of energy and effort into developing the power sector in Nigeria. It's been a privatization. I don't think we expected necessarily the buyers of these privatized assets to be who they are. There's many local players, not a lot of international players. I thought we would have seen more international players. Ask the question as to whether the rules of those engagements are going to work for the international community. So I think that if Nigeria can get a program together with transparent rules, clear rules for the private sector, and kind of clearly communicate a program, I think it's going to be a remarkable investment opportunity in Nigeria. It'll be a great opportunity that we're going to talk a lot about in the next 10 years.
Well, it was interesting. We had an interview earlier, and there was for the regulator, with the electricity regulator in Nigeria, and he is certainly very passionate about creating that transparency. So let's see where it goes.
More power to it.
Okay. So, but thank you for taking the time,
All right,
Mikael, to be here, and thank you as well for watching.